Do you find cervical exams confusing? There's so much conflicting information out there and you've probably heard different things from your friends and your family and just reading things on Google preparing for birth. There's actually 3 pieces of information that I feel like doctors don't tell us about cervical exams that if we knew, we could make better decisions, ones that work for our goals and make us really feel informed and part of the process of labor and birth. Let's go through these 3 today. The thing I find the most surprising with most of my childbirth ed students is that the cervical exam can't predict labor. So where this comes into play, it's with our 36-week, 37, 8, 9, 40-week appointment, where our provider might say at the next appointment, we're going to check your cervix. It is usually assumed by most people that having a cervical check has a purpose. That if we find out what our cervix is doing, is our cervix opening? Is it thinning? Has it changed positions? That if we get that information, that it's going to be helpful information in being able to predict when we're going to go into labor, right? Everybody wants to know when we're going to go into labor. And if we can if there's a sign, if there's a signal that lets us know, then usually we're interested in finding that out. Well, you would think that a cervical exam is done for that purpose, but really it doesn't. Cervical exams don't predict labor. You can absolutely go into labor on the same day you have a cervical exam that shows that your cervix is closed and thick and hard. You can go into labor that day. You can also not go into labor on a day where they check your cervix and you're 2 centimeters dilated and 50% effaced and it looks like your cervix is making a lot of change. You can still stay pregnant for 2 weeks or more after that. A cervical exam does not predict labor. This is really surprising. I know a lot of my clients, when they find this out, they struggle with the idea of whether or not they want one. And that's a really good question. You might be the kind of person that likes that kind of data. And even if they tell you that your cervix is closed, you want that information. It's not going to change your stress level. It's not going to increase anxiety. Or you might be the type of person that if you find out that your cervix is closed and hasn't changed at all, that you might get really sad, that you might get really frustrated, you might have anxiety about when contractions are going to start. And I really tell people, think about that. Think about what your reaction to the news would be. If it's something that might be helpful, even though it kind of doesn't have any meaning besides it lets you know where your cervix is that day, then you definitely have the option to have a cervical exam. So this really leads me to that second piece of information that your doctor usually doesn't tell you about when it comes to your cervical exam. And that is that cervical exams are optional. They're absolutely your choice. They aren't presented that way, unfortunately. It would be great if our doctors said something like, at your next appointment, your 36-week appointment, I usually offer a cervical exam, but it's completely up to you whether or not you would like one. Or at the 38-week appointment, we usually do a cervical exam. If you would like one or you'd like to talk about the pros and cons, then let's cover that at the next week's appointment. It's not usually presented that way. It's usually presented like, at your next appointment, we'll do a cervical exam. Period. So it's not presented with that optional question mark, what would you like to do kind of a moment. It's just told to you. This is really an important piece of information because I have heard from so many students, childbirth ed students, so many people planning sometimes their second baby, and they say, I had no idea that I didn't have to have a cervical exam every time that one was suggested. And a lot of people find cervical exams painful or very stressful, and they want to minimize them for as much as they can. And so just knowing that you can say to your doctor, do I have an option for this? Or I'd like to avoid this if possible, unless it's medically necessary or we're at a decision point, maybe we can skip that. So every cervical exam, you should be asked before your cervical exam is done, and just know that they are optional. So this final piece of information might just be the most important one, and that is that cervical exams come with risk. So if we really think about it, most medical procedures have some type of risk. The risk might be very low, but it's good to know what the risks are before we make our decisions. So we've already talked about that the decision to have the cervical exam is optional, and knowing that it doesn't predict labor and knowing that there are risks, you might make different decisions. Now you might make the same decision, but let's talk about the risks before I go too far down that road. There are two main risks in a cervical exam. The first is the risk of introducing bacteria that could cause an infection. So every time a cervical exam is performed, it's definitely performed with a sterile glove. However, there's still a risk of bacteria being introduced into the vagina. And what can happen with bacteria introduction is that it can cause an infection in the mom. So if you have an infection, it isn't necessarily going to harm you, but what it can do is lead to complications later in the pregnancy, in the labor. So a cervical exam that introduces bacteria can cause an infection, that can cause a fever. A fever can increase your temperature, can increase your heart rate, and that can also lead to an increase in baby's temperature and heart rate. And what that could lead to is the need for a cesarean birth. Also, a need for monitoring the baby after baby is born, if baby's born with a fever as well. So an infection is something that we're really trying to prevent in labor. And most of the time, providers that follow good research-based methods, they will limit your vaginal exams, especially after your water has broken, after your membranes have ruptured. But sometimes we still see a lot of vaginal exams that happen after the water breaks. So it's something to know that there is a risk of infection. The other risk is the risk of breaking your water. So sometimes when your cervix is checked, if the bag of water is near or pushing through the cervix or somewhere, putting pressure on the cervix, there's a risk that the provider might accidentally break the bag of water, which isn't always a bad thing, and sometimes we're planning to break the water anyway. But when you have your water broken, you are on a time clock, really. The longer that you go with your water broken, the increase of infection, like we just talked about. So where this is particularly tricky is if this happened at, say, your 38-week appointment. Your body probably wasn't ready to go into labor, and then when your water was broken, well, that started labor and starts a series of beginning of an induction, likely. So there is always a risk that your water might break. It's something for you to know. Again, more pieces of information to help you have the birth that you want. Now, I've put together my favorite videos that I feel like are a must watch before birth. I put them in a playlist that is going to be on this next screen. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.